Hello. So hi, as I said, I'm Christine, and I run an online learning platform called Moon Learning, where I talk and teach about UX, UI, and these days it's a lot of Figma. And one of the subjects that people find most challenging is always when we talk about responsive design in Figma, because we use something called auto layout, which can be a bit challenging, and we all know that challenging is a nice word for annoying. And it's not that bad, actually. So I'm going to show you some new developments around responsive design in Figma, where we can use variables to deal with this. And I also today want to talk about my absolute passion subject this year, which is container queries. And I want to, first of all, tell you what they are, because they're actually something in the browser. They're a CSS thing, so not really a UI design thing. But I want to show you how we could start, as UI designers, planning for this great development that I believe is going to change the way that we deal with responsive design. But first of all, so yeah, that was the reason I'm officially invited. But I actually have a secret superpower, which is why I usually get invited to these sorts of things. And my secret superpower is that I can make all of you feel 10 years younger with one click. So if you're 9 years old, then please leave the room now, because it might be dangerous. Otherwise, just get ready, and it's going to be 1, 2, 3, and here you go. Ah. Do you feel it? Do you feel the energy returning to your body? If you stayed up too late yesterday, it's coming back. So I showed this at another conference a month ago, and then I had a casual hand show of who didn't know what that was, and it was like half the room. So I felt a bit of an age gap happening here, and I want to be really clear about it. I'm not worried about me getting too old for the industry. I'm really worried about you wasting your youth to maintaining design systems. So we're going to do this again. So raise your hand if you don't know what this is, and I'm going to explain it. Okay, yeah, it's less. So what this was, that basically at the beginning of UI design, this is how we designed the page. Like, we had this 960 grid, we put it on this page, and we designed around it. And so what we did is basically we placed everything perfectly. We even took, when it was finished, a screenshot in the browser, and we could compare it, and we really nitty-gritty pixels here and there. And there were no other sizes. So from today, if you're looking at this, you might think, oh, that sounded like a nice time to be a designer. Like this total control, just this one page, everything perfect. But the ones who've been there with me know it was difficult times being a designer. Because, and don't get me wrong, I like Photoshop. Photoshop's fantastic if you want to edit photos, but not if you want to do UI design. There's no components, there's nothing. You're locked inside a bitmap hell, and it just doesn't work for what we're trying to do. But things moved on, and things started happening in the browser. And responsive design, I think the first article was around 2009 that mentioned that, and people got very excited. And things happened. We got media queries, we got Flexbox, we got CSS Grid, which is something I absolutely love. And recently, we got container queries. Things also moved on in the world of UI design, and we got great new software appearing. So I'm going to use Figma as an example today, but it doesn't mean that you have to use Figma. It's simply what I work in, where I believe there is great features to deal with this. But there's other great stuff around, especially if we're looking at tools like Framer. We see really, really great developments as well. So Figma also moved, and a lot of stuff happened. And especially in the area of animation these days with Figma, I can literally set up an animation in Figma in one click that's going to make my developers cry for a month. So we have to be mindful in both directions. Some stuff is super easy for us to do. But when it comes to the world of responsive design, it still feels like we're trying to catch up, and we're always trying to mimic the browser. We're always trying to be code, and we're not quite getting there. And it always reminds me of this children's story that I grew up in Germany, and so this is a very popular children's story. It's called The Race Between the Hedgehog and the Rabbit. And what it goes is basically that the rabbit knows it's very fast and is challenging the hedgehog to a race. And the hedgehog says yes, because the hedgehog is very smart. And so the hedgehog tells the hedgehog wife, who looks just like him, to stand at the finishing line. And when the rabbit arrives, to say, I'm already here, challenging the rabbit to run back. And there's the real hedgehog saying, I'm already here. So the hedgehog basically wins the race, even though it's much slower. Now, German parents love this story for several reasons. One is nobody gets eaten by a witch, which is always nice. And the other one is that people just love the moral of it. Like, you don't have to be the best one, you don't have to be the fastest, you just have to be smart. Now, I have a very mixed feeling about this story, because I just really hate it. I really don't like the idea of having to pretend to be fast or to be something when I have great skills. So if you didn't get it, it's my little metaphor that I'm going to use. The rabbit is the developers and the hedgehogs is the designers. And both have their own great tools. And so I want to use the next 30 minutes to encourage you to just move this little closer, understand each other, and embrace each other's tools, rather than trying to mimic or rather than building walls between them. So first of all, we have to start at the beginning, what is a media query, in order if we later want to understand container queries. So what is a media query? So a media query looks like this. We say add media. In CSS, we say min width, max width, whatever. We have some sort of threshold. And then within the brackets, we have our CSS that changes according to whatever we want to change at different sizes. So it'd be something like this, a font size changing, becoming larger for different screens. Now, usually it looks like this. This is what we imagine responsive design these days. We have different breakpoints. I know there is different techniques. We could use purely Flexbox and things like that. But still, this is quite a common approach that we have different breakpoints, and our design might change at these breakpoints. Now, in Figma, until now, we don't have breakpoints. So what we do is we use other tools. We use auto layout, which translates pretty much to Flexbox. We have grids, we have constraints, and with these tools, we can actually build really nice responsive designs, components, and even pages. But you will notice that at some point, if we're going too small or too large, as we're putting this all together in a page, it just doesn't work anymore, and we need some sort of breakpoint. So what we do is, and this is still absolutely fine, we set up different pages or designs for breakpoints, or we test our components on these different ranges, and then we would define how they behave per breakpoint. So we don't have just one design that would scale up and down. Now, we have a new feature since around 2-3 months called variables in Figma. And variables in Figma you use mainly for things like tokens, color, spacing, but you can also use them for responsive design really well. But I want to give you a quick introduction for those of you who don't know variables, so we're all on the same page. So Figma variables, the ones we have is color, numbers, strings, booleans, and we're desperately waiting for typography to be released, because we really need that, and they said they're going to ship that till the end of the year. And also some image variables are expected. So they look like this. We have a value, we have a name that we assign in our variables panel, and we assign a value to it, which we can obviously change and update everything. We can have several collections, so we can have color collections, we can have sizing collections, and we can have mixed collections, which is something you're going to use for responsive design. We can save them in a library, just as we did with styles before, and everybody can use the same variables. As you've seen in Molly's talk, you can get to really advanced levels, you can have primitives, you can reference them, so you can set up a very sophisticated system with these variables. And we apply them just as we did before in our user interface via the different sizing or color menus. Now, modes is where they become magic. And you don't need to use modes with variables, but you can. And I want to show you, in order to understand responsive modes, we're first going to do the mother of all modes, the light and dark mode. And how that works is pretty much so the color that I just showed you, you add a mode, and then some of them you might change for your dark mode, some of them you don't need to change, and you're simply going to add the changes you want to that collection. And thereby, it's basically independent of the value, but the name that you assign, the variable you assign, is going to hold all of this information. And the great thing is that this inherits, so you can set parent frames to inherit, and therefore you don't need these huge sets of different components in light and dark anymore. You simply have one component that knows everything that you want to do with it in different modes. And as you drag it onto a design that has a different mode assigned, it will then simply pull in the correct mode for you. Now, we can do the same with responsive design. We can assign it in such a way that we pull in the correct component, the correct setup of that component for the mode that we're working on. So we can say this is a mobile mode and this is a desktop mode. Now, how does that work? Well, we need this whole setup here, so you can't run away from auto layout anymore. We need auto layout, we need variants, and by the way, variants and variables are two things. They sound very similar, and I'm trying not to confuse them. Then variables, we need the min, max, and we need something called wrap, which if you work with Flexbox, you're familiar with. So just to remind you, what is a component set with variants? It's something like that in Figma, if we have a component that has a similar state, so we have a default and a hover state, for example, we can package them in a component set, and therefore it's a bit like what I showed you with variables. It's going to remember everything that you told it, like all its relatives, basically. So we can go between different states of hover and so on. And these sets can also become quite complex. So you can add much more in there, and you can add component properties on top. And you've seen, again, in Molly's talk, how sophisticated you can go with these systems. Now, we're going to do the same with our responsive setup. So we're just going to have one, let's say our navigation with the burger menu as a variable, as a variant, and then we're going to have one for the larger screens. And then what we can do now, we can add min and max width. So we can say till what point we want this to be used. Now, if you're coming from a development background, and then that seems really minor, but this one was just released a few months ago. We did not have min and max in Figma and had to use lots of hacks to get this going. So now we can also use wrap because we can use min and max, and therefore you don't have to have all of these rows anymore. You can just have this nice set as you would in code, and you can just have it together, and as you resize, they will reshuffle automatically. Now, the cool thing is that we can not only add this min-max to our components, but we can also, and again, here we're going a little hacky, we can use this for our frames, the frames that represent our devices. And so therefore, I can set up this frame, and I can say, this is the range that you're operating in. So I can set the breakpoints here. So I can set up a collection with my components, and in that collection, I can set up the different breakpoints, and I can say, pull in, just as I did with colors, for these breakpoints, pull in those variants from our set. So again, so this would be this set. I say pull in the S and pull in the M for another set. So like this. And so what we do now, we simply apply this. And so this is a bit of the tricky part. And if you've been at my workshop, then you know that it doesn't go as smooth as in this little recording. It's a recording for a reason. So first of all, we add the sizes here. We have to add the variables. We have to tell our frames what they are. And then we have to tell them which mode they're operating in. And so once we've set that up, so let's tell this one here it's small. And then once we set this up, we can now pull out an instance. And these instances, we also need to tell them that they are part of our new component set. And we can now tell them that they have a variable assigned. This is the navigation type. And we can now pull it over on the screen. And you will see, again, you need to add some auto layout, obviously, because it's just a standard layout then. But you will see that you will automatically get the right variable, get the right version of your component for wherever you're designing. I think I have this further. And then as we're resizing, I think here, yes, we need to add a little bit more. So the thing is that you're not going to get around your auto layout, applying your auto layout. You can still use all of your variables again to set up the spacing and everything. Now let's have a look. Let's place it over here. I'm adding some more, sorry. You have to clip it, and then you can add it. And now you can see, as we're adding it to mobile, then this is going to adjust to mobile. And you can now have these groups inside of your design that if you're pulling them over to a new version, you get this white space, which you can then solve by just adding the wrap, and then you're getting the correct component with the correct distribution for your different screen sizes. And now as you're resizing these screen sizes, you're also getting an idea of how this design will behave. You can shorten this with Booleans. So if you have something like a navigation where you're not making major layout changes, but you're just showing and hiding, you can add a Boolean. So we can add, for example, all the information in one component. And we can now simply say, we have a variable for burger, and we have a variable for our navigation items. And we can switch this on and off. So we're saying on small, the burger is on, and the rest is off, and the other way around. You need to assign this, and this is really weird, because in order to assign this, you need to go to the Layers menu, right-click on the eye icon, and this is where you find the Boolean variable. I didn't put it there. And so now we can simply drag this inside of our design, and we're going to get exactly the same effect that we had before, but we can actually delete our whole component set because we just have one component that we can use for everything that has all the information in baked. Now, this looks really nice on a simple example, and I want to be honest with you today, I promised. So it's not a perfect solution yet. We still have to change the overall layout, so we still have to go into the details. It doesn't adapt to grids, and it doesn't adapt to unequal units. So that means because we're not adapting to unequal units, we cannot use stuff like fractional units in CSS grid, which is, I find, a real limitation. We don't have typography adjusting automatically. This should be solved by the end of the year. And as you saw, this gets quite complex, so you need a lot of team training. So sometimes it might not be the best solution if, for example, you have a lot of people that just get started with Figma to use this. But it's not perfect, but it's a really great help, and it's a really great start to get people going using the right components on the right screens. So how are we doing? OK, so we are around media queries and Flexbox. We're doing really well. Flexbox is amazing by now with auto layout. Media queries, you can see, we're doing pretty well. But we want to go there. I want to be at container queries. That's the cool thing. So what are these container queries, actually? So I actually heard the first time about container queries last year during SmashingConf in New York when Una Kravitz was giving a talk about new developments in the browser. And I thought it was the coolest thing ever. And I noticed that a lot of front-end developers, they knew about this, but everybody in design they hadn't really heard or hadn't really started working with this yet. So this is my little mission to give this to you, and hopefully you're equally excited. So what they look pretty much like media queries. Instead of media, you say container. You also have min, max, whatever you want to set. And you have a threshold value, and within it changes. Now, the big difference is that we're not querying the viewport anymore. So we don't care about the viewport. We're suddenly having a look at the container that holds our component. And this is a huge difference. Because the difference is that you basically have one component that knows how to behave wherever you put it. So you might have one component set up, and it looks different whether you put it in a sidebar or whether you have it in your design. And as people resize the browser, it's going to automatically adjust to its perfect size. So it's something like this. So you have a card, and it would know at a certain threshold that it's now supposed to change its size. So here's an example, what this might look like. So you can see here, this is all the same component. And as we're resizing, you can see that the card on the right, that it's staying exactly the same, and all other cards are resizing. Now, there's more that we're not going to cover today, but I want you to be aware of. Where you can nest container queries. So you can, for example, put a button into a card, and then that button might have an icon. And as the card gets too small, the icon disappears, because the button itself can be a container query. You can combine it with breakpoints. You can combine it with CSS grid, that I believe is a match made in heaven. And there are container query units. So as you would use viewport width, you could now use container query width. And this is really great if you're using something like clamp, where you're using your typography changes according to your viewport. You could now also do that with your typography being adjusted to how much space you're giving that component, which is really great. There are more container queries. There's style container queries, and we're not going to talk about them because they're not quite ready yet. And what I'm mentioning today is all related to size. So the container query sizes, you can have a pretty good support already, unless you're using Opera Mini, and you don't use anything in this world. And there's really great polyfills, there's great workarounds, and there's fantastic articles about all of this. So they're pretty much ready to be planned for as in design. We don't have container queries in Figma, surprise. But what can we do? Well, you might say, well, you showed us these modes right now, right? We can just use those modes, and we just put them, instead of putting them on the screen, we just put them on the containers, and then it switches. That's what I thought. It's not going to work. The reason why it's not going to work is because with the modes, you could assign them, and you could switch them, but you have to manually switch it. They simply don't communicate. Like the component, if you resize it, there's no way to say, did you change size? What size do you have? What mode should you have? You can just say you have this mode. So in other words, we can't query in Figma. So this wasn't a problem when we're dealing with classic breakpoints, because we have like 4 or 5 pages we're dealing with, so we just assign those breakpoints to those pages, or even if you're testing just a row of components and making them individually, you can adjust that and you know where it's going to happen. But if we're going with media queries, then we're going to go inside of our design into all these details, and this is a very simplified version. You're going to have all these containers around that you might or might not need to query. So that doesn't work. And another reason is that's where we're going to have a bit of a struggle is you can set up container queries in such a way that they respect a grid. And therefore, you can do stuff like this, that you have it sit nicely, and once you have a CSS grid around it, you can make it respond to that grid and take that as a parent. We cannot do that in Figma either. OK, so how to query when you can't query? A question that 0.001% of the population frequently ask themselves when they wake up and go to sleep, like me. So the cool thing is, if we think about how they set up these container queries, then the container itself actually doesn't hold any information. The only thing we do, we query it. It doesn't have any responsive information otherwise. All the information is stored, and that's the beauty about this, within the component. And we can do that as designers. This is how we set up our components in Figma, because we're going back to a component set with variants inside of it. So what we can do is we can use these variants in a way that we can say, well, we're going to set up the different versions for this container query now. And I want to be really clear. This is not about designers coding. This is not about developers coming into Figma and resizing. If you want to, I think it's all great. But the idea behind it really is that we communicate a final design idea and decision, as final as stuff gets now in web design. But that we, as designers, can try things, that we know the new technologies that are happening, that we can plan for them, and that can we bring ideas on the table that we had, and that we can use the time that we have as a design and a development team together to talk about the valuable stuff, to polish the edges, and to not start from scratch talking about the most basic things which we can already test and discuss in Figma as a design team. So I would encourage you to always, what I'm going to show you, to package that away, have like a playground file somewhere where you're doing all of this. So what I do in this little playground file is basically I start my basic design and I bring my components over, and then I play with them. I put more content, less content, I resize them, and by that I can find this little magic area where they should break into a new way. And when I found that, then I go over to where I have my components stored, where everybody would access them and look for the information, and I'm adding this. I added to the naming. Depends on your team setup, might not be the ideal solution. And I, most importantly, add a min and a max value to make sure that if someone uses it, they're like stopped from using it further on. And then what I like doing is I like adding this as a property name. So I name this at component. There might be people that have like heavy breathing now because I'm naming properties as an art. But what I believe that this does is that it helps, because this is really new, people don't know about this. So if someone pulls this out and they have this instance in their design and they see at component, they're going to be like, what is this all about? And then they would go back to the documentation and they would find information or ask someone. And developers, they would see in the new dev mode in Figma a playground. And in this playground, they would see an at container and they would be encouraged to play with it. So it will be very clear that we're trying to design together for this new thing coming up. So can we push this any further? You could, if you have something that doesn't change, like that doesn't show and hide, that doesn't require changing font sizes and stuff like this, then if you simply have a layout change, then you can actually use the min-max and the auto layout that we have in Figma as if it was sort of a nested CSS grid, which I've seen a lot of people adding to container queries. So what we could do, we could add min-max, and therefore we could make this component automatically change sizes as we're resizing it. We would obviously need to add information and documentation about this, because this will not be logic to everyone else. Also, this isn't the ideal solution for everything. Because if you're in dev mode, you will see that you will still have the translation to Flexbox. So it will require a bit of discussing and adding information. And it comes with a few limitations again. So even though we want to use and communicate CSS grid in a lot of cases, we cannot do that in Figma. It just doesn't have that output. We cannot deal with Booleans like show and hide with this approach. Typography doesn't resize. Even if variables were released, this would still be an issue. And we cannot change things like colors. And again, you need team training, you need communication. But this is a new thing. So it's the same whenever new things are released. That shouldn't stop you. So let us use it. You're going to say, great, it looks like we can set up these container query things. It looks we can use variables, and we can use variants. We can set up these new fancy things. So let's build a design with it. Yeah, sorry. This is where the problem happens, because once we're adding this to our design, again, we have the problem we can't query. So we have to go in there, and we have to find the nested elements and switch them around and everything, and it's going to be messy. And in German, we call this a Sisyphus-Arbeit, which is Sisyphus work. If you don't know Sisyphus, Sisyphus was a king who was punished in the afterlife for his deceitfulness. His internal punishment was to roll a large boulder up a hill, only to have it roll back down every time he reached the top. This task was repetitive and futile, symbolizing a never-ending and ultimately meaningless effort. Sounds about right if you're trying to do this. And we're coming back to this. We don't want to race the rabbit. We want to be a hedgehog communicating with the rabbit. So as you're getting in this thing of, I'm going to make this the real thing in Figma, don't. Figma isn't code, and that is absolutely fine. What we want to do, let's reflect back. Let's focus on the actual goal. Why are we doing this? Because we want to create components using a new thing called container queries, and we want to communicate that with the rest of our designers in the team, and we want to communicate this to the developers to come a step closer and start building with them together. So what we do is we basically can set up a static design where we use the components that we set up with all that thinking, and then we have a static design and refer back to the component. Now, you might be a bit disappointing being, okay, so we're talking for 20 minutes that you tell me I'm setting up a static design. Well, yes and no, because the thing is, this might be static, but you've done all the work. You've done all the work. You know why this component is like this. And the important stuff is the documentation. You're going to tell everybody else how it works. And when they pull out an instance, when they work with your component, they're going to see how this works. There's different ways where you document. It's like it could be a small project on a separate page. It could be a separate file. It could be a whole sophisticated design system that you're using. So it doesn't matter where. So this is just a little example about how you could add this. So this is, if you would have something inside of Figma, you would have your component set, and that component set holds other versions. So you have a bit of information about anatomy. You might have some specs in there. Very important, your component doesn't only change size, it also has things like hover effects, so we would still keep that in our documentation. But then down here, we simply add what we found, and we add a link. What is this new technique we're using? Where does it break? Why does it break? And explaining it a little bit. You can also use that if you're just using a classic grid system to demonstrate how things are sitting, because this component, by the way, could still be used in your classic grid system, and just in some cases you could add container queries. It doesn't have to be everywhere. A little tip, because documenting is hard and time-consuming, there is a plugin called HShape Specs plugin, and it takes this long, as you saw, to make a documentation. You simply select your instance, you click a button, and it's going to create a documentation for you. And then all you have to do is you can add, however this is used responsively, you can simply add this to your information additionally, because it's little frames, you can pull them around. So how are we doing? Well, we did reach the present. We can use container queries. Now, we need to talk. They're not gonna, you're not going to be able to set this up in Figma, throw it out there, and it's going to magically appear. You really need to sit down, again, as a team of developers and designers, which hopefully you do all the time, but a lot of the time it gets lost because we believe there can be a documentation to solve that. It's not going to work in that case, and it's a beautiful thing. But what we can do as designers is that we can prep this, we can make this talk enjoyable. We can design, So we can design our components, we can plan that, we can design what we really want this to look like. We can test it to quite a good extent in Figma already. Then we need to sit together. We need to say, this is what we want, this is work, this is where in Figma we can't go any further. We need to see this in the browser as a whole now. And then we can document this together for everybody else joining the team and for everybody else having the opportunity to push this further. So I think if we're doing it like this, then we can really move a little closer together as developers and designers. And then we can go from racing each other, and get ready, this is really cheesy, to embracing each other. And thank you. I'm not done. Because I can tell you that's really hard to make a rabbit and a hedgehog hug with Midjourney. It's been a long time, really difficult stuff to do that. So if you like that and want to know more about being nice rabbits and hedgehogs and lovely with each other, then follow me, these days mainly on LinkedIn, and visit moonlearning.io, where I talk and teach about these sort of things, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you so much for your attention. I really, really appreciated it.
Thank you so much, Christine. We have some questions, as it always is, and wonderful questions. Casper was probably writing at the very first moment when you started. He wrote, "Thank you so much for comparing developers to the rabbits. I've never been compared with something fast for my speed."
I'm glad I made your day.
That's, you know, that's wonderful. That's wonderful to hear. Prina also came like right at the moment when you actually mentioned 8 Shapes by Nathan Curtis, right? There were a lot of questions around. Can you recommend any other magical Figma plugins that you use a lot?
I do love magical Figma plugins. So we did a whole session on pulling in data with Figma, and you can do a lot of great stuff. You can connect to APIs and things which a lot of people don't know. So I would recommend Google, I forgot the name of the plugin, great. Google Sync plugin. Yeah. So that's really great. And the best thing is go on YouTube and Google Smashing Meets, and you will see there is a video up, and there is a link to a Figma file with the plugin in it, showing how it works. There's a video of the whole discussion we had about it. So yeah, I love that, like pulling in real stuff into Figma. And another one is HTML to design. That is really great, because what you can do is sometimes you have a website or some old stuff, or you worked in another software and you have to just pull in things. So that will create a Figma version of with a URL of a live website. Mm-hmm. I also really like that.
Okay. Olivier is wondering, at some point we're implementing the UI twice, once in Figma and once in code. But just how far should we actually go in Figma?
So that you have to discuss with your team. I mean, in the end, there's a lot of factors to it. There's how many designers do you have? How many developers do you have? What's your budget? And also, how do they work together? I have met teams, they just do just a quick sketch in Figma. They don't even bother with the responsiveness, because they have such a strong front-end team that would jump in right with them. So you can absolutely do that. Others have teams at the other end of the world. They can hardly speak with each other, so you have to do more in Figma. Mm. So I think, yeah, you have to find that within your team, and also that everybody is happy on how far they're going to go into the different areas. Mm-hmm.
I think there were actually a number of questions about the handover and how it's going to work, and handoff.
Yeah, I noticed that is another hot topic.
Yes, it's always kind of a conversation, of course. I think one interesting thing that I've noticed recently in teams is that whenever it comes to handoff, like even one little thing that really helps is to just create that meeting where designers and developers get together and just discuss. Just even if it's 30 minutes or 45 minutes. And there were actually a number of questions around how do you manage handoff better. So if we are working in a place where, like, you know, organization, enterprise environment and all, where you have designers on the 7th floor, developers in another country somewhere, right? What would you suggest to teams that are remote, that are kind of collaborating but still waterfally in a way, to improve it, to get better with this entire handoff problem?
I mean, I think the remote, as much as I love it, it's also a problem, because the most stuff I ever found out about like coding and looking at the other side is not at work, but it was like you had that coffee break, you had that moment. So I feel very strongly that this is getting lost. I would encourage you to go to live events, go to meetups where people have time, where they're relaxed. There's no, at work there's so much pressure sometimes to get things done. So go to where people are coming to relax and talk about code and design, and where they enjoy changing, like conferences like this, where you can exchange these ideas and try to find out. And I always found when I come with a little bit of knowledge, like when I say, when CSS Grid and all of that started, when I came and I said, I read a little bit about this great thing, can you explain me more? That was a great intro, rather than coming with like zero and being like, I designed this. Can you explain me how the world works in code? So read articles about code, get started to understand what's happening. How does typography work in code? Don't just design with typography. Understand how that's going to be implemented, because then you have a conversation that people can actually start at a different level. And I think even with design, you would also appreciate that if someone doesn't start talking to you about the basics, but comes at the level where you feel you also have a value about it.
There is an unpopular opinion.
Okay, great. Bring it
It's
on.
coming. It's coming. How do you make sure that developers understand designers? Oh, we're getting a very philosophical debate. How do you prepare the design? What works well based on your experience? It's kind of all, I think that a lot of questions are all around kind of handoff, but I think it's more about, the question, I guess, the angle is documentation enough? Or you can go a lot, like with edge shapes and all, to really document everything and have the pixel value for everything, or the token that you're using and everything. Is this enough, or what needs to happen? Developers not understanding us.
This is a conference where I find. Usually at, the last one was a developers conference, and it was the other way around.
Yeah, like developers, how can you make designers understand us? This was kind of the spirit.
Well, first of all, I always find the term developer very broad, because I find that if you're a front-end developer and a back-end developer, the mindset that what you're working on is so different. And so usually, yes, a lot of the time, back-end developers are probably not going to be too interested in your pixel art, where you're going all detailed. There is some full-stack developers. I've met very few where I believe that is really the full range. But your front-end developers, they're genuinely interested in design. That they also want this to look good. And so I would try to do stuff with your front-end developers and sit together. And yeah, the documentation is not going to be a substitute for a good talk, but it's going to be like what I said, it's going to be this, you putting the talk you're having on another level. You're not starting from scratch every time. You're talking about the details. You're saying, I thought about this. I'm trying to make your life easy. And if your front-end developer says, I don't want you to do all of this testing, I prefer doing it in the browser, go for it. Like, that's fine. I would still document it, because he might go on holidays, he might be away, someone else. I keep on saying he when I say developer, he, she. I'm sorry about that. I'm really annoyed about this myself. Yeah, totally with you. So, like, be prepared that someone else might come in that might need a documentation. So I am always for a good documentation with a good talk combined.
Jonas is wondering, how do you manage iterations within Figma, especially when working on larger projects with multiple team members?
Pardon?
Iterations, I think, like when we're talking about revision, version history, and all these things.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, if you're in an organizational plan, I think you get something where you can branch and things like that. I don't usually work with this, so I'm not at firm with this. So have a look at these organizational and enterprise plans. You can do branching and stuff like that. And I think if you're in these plans, and you even get training from Figma, like, I think so, on how to do that. So I would have a look at that sort of branching things, rather than having these different files.
A few other questions that came up. One from Bruno. We have a few minutes. Currently, we're struggling with the device pixel rate, Windows DPR, mostly 125% scale on Windows laptops. Could you also set this up with variables and modes?
If you're having like pixels.
Yeah, so it's like we're talking about Windows DPR, device pixel rate, which is different, I guess, from Mac. But
I mean, usually, maybe I'm getting this wrong, but usually when you're designing in Figma, you always design at 1x, where 1 point is 1 pixel. And the reason is that everybody is like, everything vector based is fine with that, and everything like images, you can export at any rate, and there's presets for Android, for iOS, so you would use that. So usually the scaling up and down, that wouldn't be an issue.
Okay. Matthias is also wondering, how do you create a responsive image with a fixed aspect ratio in Figma? Plugin or no plugin?
No, I personally don't like the plugin, but I've used the last plugin I've used like a year ago, so maybe there's new stuff out there. No, I use, if you go to the Figma community and you type in aspect ratio, there is a really great file. There are several files. It's usually the first one that turns up. And someone made a very, very complicated hack about nesting and nesting and nesting, and I usually use that image. And you can simply, he has lots of different aspect ratios. You can take that image, put it in your own file, and design with it and put your image in.
Okay, so we have a few more. One of them is coming from Raj, but I think that might be difficult to answer. Are you aware of any plans to have better support for container queries inside Figma?
Any brands?
Any plans?
Any plans? No. I mean, not even the... We still have the responsive stuff not solved completely. I don't know, like I didn't ask, but it doesn't look like something focused. I feel that container queries, for how powerful I believe they are, they're getting a bit under the radar in the design community. And so, but if all of you now use container queries and all of you write to Figma that you want this, then that's how it works.
Yeah, so I think that there are many, many questions around basically one single topic. And Hendrik is saying, so I'm not looking to start a fight here.
I'm great that I have like a timer here.
Yeah, the timer is like very dramatic, like getting to 0 almost. But if you're adding all of the abstract elements to a design tool for mimicking browser behavior, why not design immediately in the browser, or why not move faster to the browser? Where should this design work be happening?
Well, a lot of the time, because there aren't enough developers in the team that want to do that. They're very expensive, and that's a brutal reality. And it's cheaper a lot of the time to do it in Figma. And you don't have to use it just because they're adding features there. If you are that team that can jump right in the browser, which a lot of teams are, it's wonderful, then go for it. But I see a lot of designers being stuck, not being able to try it out, and then having very limited resources in development for a next step.
That makes sense. Finally, do you have any particular wish list features that you'd love to see implemented in Figma anytime soon?
I do, and I do nag my friends at Figma about them the whole time.
Like what?
Aspect ratio and CSS grid support, much rather than container queries, still like in the future, but fractional units. I need fractional units.
Well, the future looks interesting. I think it's very interesting just to see the evolution of how many things actually have come out recently.
Yeah.
Of course, there is always the question in the room about Adobe XD, Figma. You know, some people are actually using Adobe XD and they kind of feel a bit stuck. Can we move? How do we move? But this is probably a difficult question to answer within minus 43 seconds.
It's like, if it works for you and your team, the tool, then use it. Figma is great now. I think it's the best tool on the market right now. But then stuff is going to change, and so who knows what's going to happen in 5 years. If you're starting right now, I'd say look into Figma because it's really amazing.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Christine.
Thank you.
Wonderful insights.